Welcome to another video. Today we'll be looking at the Sicilian Najdorf, one of the most famous chess openings. It's named after the Grandmaster Miguel Najdorf. So let's get starting. It goes as follows: e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, and knight c3. And here comes a6. This is the move that symbolizes the Najdorf defense. And this is played in so many games. It was frequently used by Garry Kasparov and also a lot of other players in the modern era. Players like Maxime Vachier-Lagrave or Anish Giri have all used this to great effect. So here I want to suggest quite an interesting move. Rook to g1. And this is not the most common move. The idea is to push pawn g2 to g4, putting pressure. Let's imagine black doesn't do anything. He plays a move like rook a7. Okay, just to illustrate. White wants to push g4 and then play g5 and push away this knight on f6, which is otherwise standing quite well. Against this, black has a lot of different options, but let's look at some of them. The main way to play for black is to push pawn e5, hitting the knight on d4 and forcing white to move. This is the main line, which we will get back to. But let's first look at some of the alternatives for black. One move for black can play is pawn to g6, intending to fianchetto the bishop on g7. Then we can play pawn to g4, bishop g7, pawn to g5, hitting the knight on f6. Black has the move. If he goes to h5, we will play bishop to e3, defending the knight on d4, intending to push bishop to e2. For example, knight c6 and bishop e2. And here white is doing great because he's attacking the knight on h5, and also he will play queen d2 and long castle. For this reason, a lot of black players have chosen to play knight d7, and after that we can simply play bishop e3 with similar ideas, put the queen on d2, put the king on c1 with long castling, and all is great. For this reason, g6 is not such a scary option. Black also has other ideas. One is to push h5, the idea being very clear that if we now play g4, which is not good, he can take h takes g4, opening up the rook, and we're simply a pawn down. So right now, pawn to g4 is not working, and for this reason, I'll recommend to play bishop to g5, now making use of black having pushed the pawn all the way to h5, and now he can no longer play pawn to h6. For example, if black plays a move like knight d7 and we play bishop g5, black now has h6, pushing away the bishop. But this is no longer possible after pawn to h5, after where we can play bishop g5, and our idea is pretty simple. We want to play queen d2 and long castle, and all is looking great. After h5, bishop g5, black has an option of playing knight d7 to protect the pawn on the knight on f6. Sorry. Then we can play as said queen d2, and if black pushes b5, we can castle long. And here I just want to show a funny line. If black plays b4, hitting the knight on c3, we can now play knight d5. And at first glance, it might look like white is in trouble because black can take this pawn on e4, hitting the queen, hitting the bishop. But then we can play queen takes b4. If black takes the bishop, we will play knight c6, and the queen is trapped on c8. It cannot go to c7, cannot go to b6 or a5, and white is winning. So h5 is not the most challenging. Black can also try to play a move like knight c6. Then we can push g4. And here is actually a very cool line. If black now takes this knight on d4, we'll take with the queen. And now it looks like he can simply take this pawn on g4 with the bishop. What's the problem? If I take here on g4, it's no good. Or so it seems. Because black will take on g4. And right now, white is exchanged down. We lost our rook. But here, white can actually play queen to a4 check, hitting the black king. And if black plays a move like queen d7, white will play bishop b5. Black cannot take it because we will take with the knight. And if he takes on b5, we will take his rook. Black plays queen d8, and we will take on b7. And the next move we will perhaps play a move like queen takes b5 or knight b5, and white is winning here. So after queen a4 check, black can also try to block everything with b5. But then here comes the great point. We can take knight takes b5. The point being, if he takes a b5, we will play bishop takes b5. And because this king doesn't have any escape square, the only move for black to play is queen d7 here. And we'll take queen takes a8 checkmate. So for this reason, bishop takes g4 is simply losing for black, quite surprisingly. So instead, after queen d4, black can also try to take the pawn with the knight. But this also leads to a lot of trouble. After knight d5, white will get a great initiative here. I'll just show one sample line. For example, if black now plays knight e5, threatening a fork on f3 with the knight, white can play queen c3, threatening another fork on c7, and white has a great game here. He is almost winning. For this reason, after knight d5, black is in a lot of trouble. So taking this pawn on g4 is very dangerous. Instead, black can try to play a move like e5, but then we'll simply retreat our queen to d1, defending the pawn on g4, and all is fine. So this was knight c6. Now we went over some of the alternatives. Now we'll look at a more direct move. For example, if black plays the move pawn to b5 here, sometimes aiming at playing b4, we will not be scared. We will play g4, continuing our plan of expansion on the king side. If black now plays a move like b4, we will play simply knight to d5. And if black now takes this pawn on e4, it might look tempting, but as we also saw in the videos about the Berlin, taking this pawn is very often dangerous. Moves like bishop g2 can happen, and the knight is in a lot of trouble here. For example, he cannot now retreat, because then we can take knight takes f6, intending to take the rook on e8 with a great game. If he plays a move like knight c5, we will simply take this pawn on b4, again hitting the rook on a8, and black is in a lot of trouble. So taking this pawn is quite dangerous, also as we saw in some of the videos about the Spanish sidelines, and in general it's not so easy. So some black players have instead tried to take this knight on d5, but then we will simply capture. Next few moves we'll put the bishop on e3, a bishop on g2, and white has a great game. So instead here, black usually goes for bishop to b7, challenging the diagonal on from a8 to h1. After this move, we will play bishop to g2. And right now, black has some different options. If you choose to play pawn to b4, we'll play knight to d5, again with a great position. Similarly, if black plays a move like e5, hitting our knight, we'll now go aggressively. We'll play the knight to f5. Black can now play a move like b4, hitting the knight, intending, let's say we put the knight on e2. Now he can probably take, at some point he can take our pawn here on e4, and we lost the pawn, so we don't want to do this as white. Instead, after b4, now comes a very typical reaction. We'll now attack his knight. We'll play g5, and there is some funny tension, like he can take our knight, but we can take his. So let's say he does that, b takes c3, we will take his knight on f6. And now if he takes on b2, it's a big mistake because we can take on g7. And if he now makes a queen, takes our rook, we can also take his rook and make a queen. And somehow our queen is much stronger than his queen because we're now threatening moves like knight g7, or we're even threatening a funny tactic here, like if he moves the rook here, we can take this bishop. And if he takes back with the king, we can play bishop h6 check. And the next move, his queen on a1 is hanging. So at this moment, black instead will usually play queen takes f6. We will take back the pawn. And next move, we will activate our rook with a move like rook to b1, hitting the bishop on b7. This will be illustrated right now. g6, rook b1, ignoring the threat on the f5 knight, simply attacking his bishop. Bishop goes to c6, and we will now play knight e3, at some point intending to put the knight on d5. And overall, the position is very complicated, but probably it's around equal, although I think the position is quite dangerous for black. Let's just illustrate that. If he plays a move like bishop to g7, white can play bishop a3, and already black is in huge trouble because of the d6 pawn. There have been some other games, could be played like knight d7, and white will now put the knight on d5. Black cannot take this knight because white will simply recapture, and black is in trouble. The rook is hanging on a8, and this is no good. So instead, black can play a move like queen d8, and then white has some different options here. One is to play bishop h3, but the game is very complicated here. Anyways, now we looked at the move pawn to e5 at this position. Black also has a slightly more tame approach to play e6, simply defending this key square on d5 where we usually land our knight. After e6, we will continue with our plan, pushing the pawn to g5, targeting the knight on f6. Black has to move, and we'll play a move like bishop to e3, continuing our development. At some point it would be great to castle long, because we already moved our rook from h1 to g1, and therefore we cannot castle short. Also, here is some interesting line. If he, for example, plays b4, white has two options. Of course, we can play simply knight e2, that's fine. We can also be very aggressive and sacrifice this knight with knight to d5. If black now takes the knight, e takes d5, we can play e takes d5. And because there's a square on f5, white has a lot of initiative. Also a very strong pawn here, and the black pieces are struggling. So most black players here have tried to play knight to b6, intending sometimes to play the knight to c4, and simply making room also for the other knight to go to d7. Here now I have some quite aggressive suggestion here to push e5. Also other moves are possible, but this is a very interesting one, because if black now closes the game with pawn to d5, we can play queen to g4, intending next move to castle long, and there is a great initiative for white. If black now takes our bishop, the most logical move, we will take back with the rook. And here, if black now plays the very logical move, d takes e5, pawn takes pawn, we now have a very nice tactic, knight takes e6. And this means that if he takes back on e6, we can take his queen, he will take back with the king, and we can take bishop takes b6 check. And here black is in big trouble because of the weak pawns on e6 and e5. Instead, black can try to take our queen first. We will take back with the rook. And this knight is simply too strong here on e6, so black has to remove it. F takes e6. And then we'll play bishop takes b6. And again, black has issues with the pawns on e5 and e6. So after rook takes g2, and the strong Indians, they recommend black to play knight to c4. And now the game gets very complicated. I want to recommend to take on d6. Now it's actually quite funny that if black takes the bishop, he's almost losing after pawn takes knight, bishop takes d6, and queen h5, followed by long castle. And because of the advantage of development for white, black is in big trouble. For this reason, it's more recommended for black to play a move like bishop takes d6, after where white can play queen h5, again threatening ideas like knight takes e6. And in general, this position is very complicated. The best move for black is now to play g6, and white has two options here: to play queen to h3, it's one option, or also to play queen f3, hitting the rook on a8. But I will not go further into this position, as it's already been very far, but it's quite an interesting one, with chances for both sides. Okay, so now we've been looking a lot at b5 early in the game. This is one of the best options for black, but white will play g4, and after bishop b7, bishop g2, we get a very interesting game. Instead, now I want to take a look at the main line, which is e5. This is a very typical way for black to play in Najdorf. You want to push away this knight. This knight has to go to b3 now. And black has different options here. But one of them being to play h5. And this is quite similar to the line we looked at before with h5 at move 6. So after e5, knight b3, h5, we will again play our idea with bishop to g5, making use of this square is now unprotected by any pawn. The next move, we will play queen d2. For example, bishop e6, we can play queen d2, and we intend now to castle our king long. If black plays very aggressively here, like a move like b5, there's actually a very interesting way to take this knight. We usually don't want to take knights this early in the game, but it's for a very concrete reason. When black recaptures with the queen, we can now play pawn to a4. And if black plays b4, which is usually the desired way to meet such push, we will play knight d5, hitting the queen and hitting also the pawn. So if black, for example, takes now, we'll take with the queen. And black has a very bad bishop. We have a great bishop on f1, and also we intend to long castle, and white is doing great here. Instead, black can take on a4, we'll take back with the rook, and also now we want to trade the bishops and play for a very nice square on d5 with the knight. Anyways, this was a bit of a side, but after h5, bishop g5, again white has great chances. Another way for black to play is to play the bishop to e7, but this is very nice for us because then we can simply continue with our plan of pushing the g-pawn, g4, intending now to push g5. Black cannot accept g5 because then his knight will become too passive. So one way for black to play is h6, but we don't care much about this. We will simply push our pawn to h4, intending to push g5. And now black has a very interesting way trying to stop this push of playing the knight to h7. The idea being that if we play g5, he simply has more attackers on the pawn than we have defenders. But actually we can still play pawn to g5, intending to sacrifice our pawn. Right now he's threatening to take the pawn on h4. So here we can play a very strong move, pawn to g5. If black takes, we will now play knight to d5. And this is quite surprising, but actually black is lacking a lot of development here. If he plays a move like g4, white can simply play bishop to e3, intending to play bishop b6 with a lot of initiative. Instead, black can also take another pawn. So right now actually white is 2 pawns down, but this is not a big issue because we will now play queen to h5, pinning the knight on h7 and the rook on h8. Quite a headache for black, and it's quite hard to get rid of this queen on h5. For example, if he plays a move like g6, here is a very nice line for white. We can take the pawn, If he takes back with the pawn, we will take here. And if he moves the king to the side, he will become checkmated. So this is not acceptable for black. Instead, he can try to flee. He can play a move like king d7. But also here we have a winning idea to play bishop to h3 check. King has to go to c6, it's the only move. And then bishop takes c8. And white is simply winning here because the king is too weak. And if black takes now this bishop, we have knight takes e7, hitting the knight, hitting the queen, hitting the king, and white is winning. So instead of bishop e7, which gives us very good chances of getting a great initiative, black has also tried to play b5 at this moment. And now we will of course continue our plan, playing g4, putting pressure on black. And we have a very similar situation as before. If black pushes pawn b4, we'll play knight d5. And again, if he takes this pawn, it's very dangerous because of bishop g2, and the knight is in a lot of trouble. Instead, black can also try to take our knight. We will recapture now with the queen, and hitting the rook on a8. Black can play rook a7, and we will again hit the rook, bishop e3, eyeing the rook on a7, intending at some point to long castle. Black can, for example, hit our queen with bishop e6, but then we can play queen to a5, and white is doing much better in this endgame. Again, this b4 is somewhat premature, so black instead can play bishop b7, eyeing the pawn on e4. And here white has a very strong way of playing, is to play queen f3, defending the pawn on e4. And as you saw before, if black now tries the b4 plan, we again have this intermediate move, pawn to g5, hitting the knight on f6, while black is hitting our knight. So for example, if he takes our knight, we will take his knight, and white is doing great here. One funny line is if he takes our on b2, we can take on g7, and if he makes a queen, we'll also make a queen, and black's king is in a big trouble. Also, his queen right now is hanging on a1. So for this reason, b4 again is premature. So if he cannot play b4, he should try to stop our expansion with g5 with a move like h6. After this, we will also stop his expansion with move a3, stopping the pawn push to b4. And now we simply want to develop this bishop and castle long. So let me illustrate. The knight can go to d7. We can play bishop to d2. He can play rook c8. And here white should actually watch out, because in a lot of Sicilian positions, black wants to take our knight on c3. So he can give up the exchange, but he will often win the pawn on e4, giving him a lot of counterplay in the center. So here we want to stop this idea with the simple move, bishop d3, defending the pawn on e4. Now taking this knight is premature, because we will take bishop takes c3. And as the e4 pawn is defended, all is good for white. So now we've been looking at b5. We will now turn to the main line, which is bishop e6. This is a very typical way for black to develop in the Najdorf, but this will not stop our plan. So we will play pawn to g4, expanding on the king side. Here, if black plays a move like bishop e7, we'll push g5 and the knight will be in trouble. The same thing will happen after knight c6. We'll also play pawn to g5. Black has to retreat the knight to, for example, d7. And we'll play bishop to e3. And white has a great position here where he can follow it up with moves like queen d2, knight d5, or long castling. And everything is looking great. Instead, black can also try to stop our move with pawn to h6, but this will not stop us because we will simply play pawn to h4, intending now to push g5. And black has trouble now because he cannot really stop our advance of g5 anymore. Instead, he will try to react in the center, opening up the game with pawn to d5. Right now, we don't want to push g5 because then he can simply take our pawn on e4, and if we take back, he will take back, and we're a pawn down, which is not satisfactory for us. Instead, after d5, we will take now this pawn on d5. Black will take knight takes d5. One funny thing is if he takes with the bishop, we can play g5, attacking the knight on f6. And when this knight has to move, we will take this bishop on d5, simply emerging a piece up. So knight takes d5 is mandatory for black, and after knight takes d5 and bishop takes d5, we have a very nice rook lift here of playing rook to g3, intending to play rook to d3, creating a very nasty pin on the black bishop. For example, knight c6, rook d3, knight b4, rook d2, and the next move we can play pawn to c3, and black is in a lot of trouble. Also note, if he takes our pawn on h4, we can now take the bishop, because if he takes back knight takes d5, we will take queen takes d5, and now we have a bishop and a knight for a rook, which is much better in the middle game. For this reason, black players will mainly take queen takes d5, queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, and now we want to play bishop e3, intending now to long castle, and at some point putting our pawn on h5. Let's just illustrate this quickly. Knight c6, for example, long castle, and we'll play a move like c3, and later we'll put the pawn on h5, and in general, I feel that this endgame is slightly better for white. White has the better pieces and also slightly easier to play, especially this knight on c6 is not doing so well because he cannot go to b4, he cannot go to d4, and in general this is nice for white. So this was h6 in move 8. Let's now instead take a look at a very similar line to play pawn to d5 for black. We will play also in a very similar manner. We will take on d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5. Now again, if he plays bishop to d5, we'll play rook g3 with the same idea as before. We simply want to put the rook here to create this very disgusting pin. Like knight c6, rook d3, knight b4, rook d2, and black has the same issues as before. Black can now try to get out of this pin by playing a move like bishop e6. Then we can take the queen, king takes d8, and we can play bishop to d2, and we're intending to castle long, sometimes playing knight to a5, for example knight c6, we can play knight a5, and in general white has a great initiative here. So instead of this, after knight takes d5, black should play queen takes d5, and we will again play queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, and bishop e3. Again intending to castle the king to the queen side. For example, after knight to c6, we will castle long. And now black has two options. Either he can also castle long, which is the main line, but he can also play this bishop on d5, going to f3, hitting our rook on d1. Then we will play rook to e1. And after a move like long castling, we can play bishop to b6, pressuring this rook. If black now moves this rook, which he should do, for example to d7, we can play move like rook g3. Black has to defend this bishop or move it, so he could for example play pawn to e4, defending the bishop. We can now play a very strong move here, pawn to g5, intending now to put the bishop on h3, creating a pin on the rook and the black king. And white is simply doing excellent here. Black is in a big trouble. For this reason, it's more advisable for black to castle long as well. So after long castling, we'll play a similar theme. We'll play bishop to b6, hitting the rook on d8, and black has to move it. He has two options. Either he can go to d7 or he can go to d6. Let's first look at rook d7. After rook d7, white will now play knight to c5, hitting this rook. And if black now takes this knight, we will take back. And because of the two bishops, white is having an advantage here. And also the engine thinks like this. So it's not just me claiming something without reason. And also I find it more pleasant to have the bishop pair, and they can often be very useful in the endgame. If black instead plays a move like rook d6, we can now play g5, again intending to play bishop h3, putting a lot of pressure on the black king. Black actually only has one way of playing now, and it gets very complicated, but if he finds all the best moves, maybe he can survive. Move like knight d4, hitting this bishop on b6, putting pressure on white. White will continue with bishop h3 check. Now moving the king is a big mistake, because if he plays a move like king b8, we'll play knight d7 check, and he cannot take this knight because we will take bishop takes d7. And if he moves the king again, we will simply take this knight on d4. If he takes pawn takes d4, we can now play rook takes d4, pinning this bishop on d5 and the rook on d6, and black is in a lot of trouble here. Instead, black only has one way of playing here, which is bishop e6, and then we can take this bishop with the knight. And here, for some reason, black has a miracle way of surviving all of this trouble, which is to play knight to e2, check. But this is very complicated, and you can see this in the analysis on the chess. But a very logical way for black would be to take back with the knight on e6, but after rook takes d6, bishop takes d6, and a move like a4, white is doing much better, again because of the bishop pair, giving white a great advantage here. Anyways, now we've been looking at rook d7. The main move for black is rook d6, and after that, we again will play our very typical plan of activating a rook via the third rank with rook to g3. Sometimes we're threatening now to play rook to d3, but also it's nice to have the rook here in general if something should happen. If he plays a move like bishop e7, we can now turn back to our plan of playing g5, and sometimes playing bishop to h3, and just in general creating space on the king side. Black could play a move like bishop to e6, and then we can play bishop g2, and I feel that white has some pressure here with the bishop on b6 and the bishop on g2 on the black position. Instead, after rook g3, black can also try to play a move like bishop to e6, and then here white has this very strong reply to play knight c5 here, hitting the bishop on e6, and if we can get the bishop pair, it would be great for us. The line continues rook takes d1, king takes d1. We're now hitting the bishop on e6, and it would be very risky for black to now grab this pawn on h2, go for a fissure, where he lost a very famous game, because then we'll play the pawn to b3, and the bishop is trapped, and we will simply come and take it with the king. So this is not advisable for black. Instead, after king takes d1, black can play bishop takes c5, and we will recapture, and again we will have the bishop pair and trying to claim an edge in the endgame. So this was my analysis of how to play against the Najdorf. Let's just make a short recap of what we should do with white. The idea is to play rook g1. We want to push g4. If black plays h5, we'll put the bishop on g5, now making use of this great square where it cannot be hit by the black h-pawn. If black instead plays the move b5, we will continue with our option of playing g4, bishop b7 and bishop g2, leading to very dynamic play. Let's look now quickly at the main line. After rook g1, e5, we will play knight b3, and the next move we will play g4 with the idea of playing g5 and pressuring the black knight. Thanks a lot for watching this video. I hope it will give you some ideas to what to do against the Najdorf defense. See you around. Bye bye.